But without further ado, welcome to everyone joining us, to ACC, to the CASI crew, and everyone else that may be out there. So we're going to start off today's event on panel one. Panel one is going to talk about artificial intelligence kind of writ large to begin with, and then we're going to look at some specific cases for both China and Russia on this, because it's all great power competition. So without further ado, the speakers' bios are up online. Hopefully you got the links there. If not, I can give it out here. I'll put it in the chat so everybody can see it. But without further ado, we'll turn it over to Mr. Peter Singer, who will kick it off and give us an overview of the state of artificial intelligence. So Peter, over to you. And you should be able to share your slides. So.
Great, thank you very much. Actually, if you can allow me to share video as well. Okay. Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to join you all for this discussion. It's some fantastic fellow speakers and absolutely important and interesting topic. So just really jazzed to join you. I also know that at a certain point, you're going to get tired of looking at my face on screen. So hopefully we should have the slides will work in there for you. And essentially what I was asked to speak to is the overall future of technology, and particularly as it relates to artificial intelligence. And there's a challenge in that many people argue that, hey, we get it wrong so frequently that we just shouldn't try it, that there's a long history of this, and that the best parallel for it is that it's akin to driving in the dark with your headlights off. There's a couple of challenges with that. The first is we don't have a choice. Whether you work in research, budgeting, doctrine, intelligence, training, you name it, you have to make assumptions and decisions about the future. It's unavoidable. The second, though, is that when we got it wrong, so to speak, very rarely is it because of the unimaginable, the so-called black swan. Instead, more frequently, it is because of what you can think of as the gray rhino, something that is big, obvious, staring us in the face, but it's just uncomfortable to look at, uncomfortable to deal with. And I think that very much captures what's going on today. When we think about the trends of technology, it's very clear that artificial intelligence is an incredibly important and arguably maybe the most important historic technology change going on. I'm not the only one who would say this. We see this in everything from NATO to US military commissions and reports and new task forces to there was a survey of leaders and they asked them, what do you think is the most important technology out there, the game-changing technology? And 91% of them replied that they believed it to be artificial intelligence. But honestly, I don't think we are anywhere near to recognizing or wrestling with what it truly means. If you think about a historic parallel, I think in many ways we are akin to the battleship captains back in the 1930s, who just a couple of years earlier had turned a blind eye to the recent science fiction technology of flying machines. It becomes real in World War I. They deny it. And then by the 1930s, they say, no, don't you tell me that I'm not on board with all the changes of airplanes. I get it. In fact, I'm such a fan of airplanes that I'm giving up valuable deck space and budget to put airplanes on my battleship. And the airplane, it is going to make my battleship more lethal than it's ever been before. It's going to be able to spot the enemy fleet at greater distances. It's going to be able to make my main guns more accurate than they've ever been before. So I am embracing and ready for the future. Essentially, they were embracing change just enough not to change. And as you see here, this is a picture of the battleship Arizona pre-Pearl Harbor. We've given our Navy example, an airplane example. Let's look at the ground version of this back in the day. This is from a US Army training exercise in 1931. So machine guns, we've gotten it. They've been used and had such great impact in World War I. So by the 1930s, we are ready for it. We have put the machine gun on the back of our horse-drawn wagon. So think about it. When it comes to the field of AI and increasingly autonomous robotics, it's gone in our lifetime from being something in science fiction to, if you're talking about AI, it's disrupting fields that range from medicine to finance, you name it. And in turn, we have a wide array of increasingly autonomous robotic systems in all sorts of different forms and sizes. One of the other big changes is they're in numeric scale like never before. You can see illustrations here on the left, a Chinese truck launched system for the military. So on the bottom right, this is one of the this is actually the world record holder in autonomous drone swarm 3800 by the Genesis company just a couple of weeks back. But of course, just don't think about this as robotics. It's changing across the board in the military, from logistics, smart bases, medicine, you name it. And this all nests within a much larger economic revolution. For example, an Oxford University study looked at 702 different job specialties and found that 47% of them were at risk for either reduction or complete replacement over the next 20 years. And this is what we wrestled with in August Cole and my book, Burn-In, where the subtitle of it says it all, a novel of the real robotic revolution, that what we have looming is not the killer robots revolution against us, but rather what it means to live, work, fight through a new kind of industrial revolution. So what does this mean for warfare? Well, I believe it yields a massive rethink of the battlefield, maybe even entire new doctrines of war, everything from training to tactical shifts. Think about this. Go back to those historic examples, the kind of shifts that we saw coming out of the machine gun or the flying machine, the tank, wireless. Why would we think that robotics and AI would somehow be less than that? And of course, when you add in the fact that it's a different kind of technology, increasingly intelligent, autonomous, it really ought to be more than that. And so the ripple effects hit everything from the fact that this technology, of course, is not just going to be in our hands, but in adversary hands. But it's not just that other players will have it. Other players may have, particularly when we think about the challenge of China, even better technology in this space than us. This is fundamentally different than back in the Cold War, where the Soviets were really only peer competitors in their areas of rocketry in the early part of the space race, but never, build stealth or a decent personal computer or a decent car. When you think about and we're going to hear about the incredible things that they've got going on in quantum or hypersonics. Another key shift is all of this technology, it's networked together. And so that introduces a whole new kind of threat and activity. And these trends, not just for China, but well beyond, bundle together to make every single kind of threat actor, every single battle, multi-domain. That is, whether we're talking about against a non-state, like we've seen in the Middle East, non-state actors using drones or conducting cyber warfare, not just battling on the ground, or if, as August Cole and I looked at the realm of conflict with China, you will see battles in every single domain where they will ripple back and forth to shape each other. And that, of course, yields a need for a fundamentally different type of thinking, doctrine, training, you name it, when you move from kind of this two-dimensional to multi-dimensional chess. And, if you know your science fiction, really the only good player at 3D chess was Spock. So what does that mean for us moving forward? But again, don't just think of it on that level. It's the fact of not just new matching or even better capabilities, it's how it might all come together in new ways. So it wasn't just that you had the airplane or the radio, it's that you yielded this new thing called the blitzkrieg. So we might see the same of entire new doctrines. And I know we've got some fantastic speakers. Elsa, I think, is going to be hitting this, but how nations like China are wrestling with this and might yield entire new approaches. I'd point to two things in particular. One is the writing in the open source on military intelligization as opposed to information dominance. And second, what's been written by Chinese military strategists and things like PLA Daily on the quote, new concepts. And a key part of it is not just intelligization, but to quote from one of the articles last year, a vision that the future of war will be, quote, small but numerous, defeating the big but few. But here again, there's larger issues at play. Go back to the last industrial revolution. It was not just about new weapons, new doctrine. It was also about entire new ideologies, concepts that range from children's rights and workers' rights to fascism, communism. We will be going through that similar kind of shift. So in closing, what can we do about this? I'd suggest a couple of things. The first is education and awareness as leadership right now. We need to do a better job as leaders, as individuals, but also for the organizations that we lead to close those gaps in terms of what are the key new trends and understanding them. So go back, AI, 91% of leaders saying this is the most important new technology out there. 17% of leaders self-report that they understand it, how it works, what are the ways that it might be used, issues like algorithmic bias. That is an incredibly large delta that we need to close. So identify for yourself, what do you think are the most important things? How well do you and your organization understand them? Next, we need to change the way that we visualize the future and prepare for it. For instance, a lot of our training in wargaming is too much in the realm of validation and honing skills, as opposed to those, go back to a previous era, the equivalent of the Louisiana maneuvers, where we're not just validating existing skills, but learning, hey, how do you use tanks differently? What are the different types of officers that might thrive? This also means we need to learn from others. And in particular, this is a key part of the doctrine. The blitzkrieg, it dominates in the early years of World War II, but it was actually all tested out in the open in the Spanish Civil War. So what are those conflicts out there today that we might look at? A good example would be the recent war between Azerbaijan and Armenia, where unmanned systems were at the crucial part of Armenia suffering 47% of their combat vehicles and 93% of their artillery and missile systems taken out, and a sea change. We also need new means of communicating. If you know my own career, I've done both, the nonfiction white papers and the like, but I've also delved and I've referenced of something that we call useful fiction, which is using the combination of scenarios and nonfiction to help explicate and make real these trends that we're talking about. Useful fiction is the equivalent of sneaking fruit and veggies into a smoothie. So science fiction, it's a milkshake. A white paper, it's the chalky diet drink. Useful fiction is the combination. And to give an example of this, not just our books, but how you might apply it to your own work, we did a project with the Australians where they had a white paper on defense education enterprise reform, 17 pages of really smart stuff, but kind of dry. They contracted us to turn that into a visualization called Eye for a Storm. Our visualization was read by over 10,000 people, all the way up to the head of the entire Australian military. So you can use useful fiction to both help visualize, but also reach wider audiences. And then finally, in closing, we need to start killing our sacred cows. What are the equivalents of the battleship or the horse-drawn carriage back in the day? And I'm not just talking about systems. I'm talking about approaches, even down to the wire diagrams of how we do command and control, et cetera. So to go back in history, the major losses that the US has taken in war, the most historic ones, they didn't happen because we didn't have the technology. They happened because we got it wrong. On the left, Battle of Little Bighorn. These are the Gatling guns that were assigned to General Custer's unit. He left them behind because essentially he assumed that machine guns were like artillery and they wouldn't be useful. We'd remember General Custer very different if he had brought machine guns with him to that fight. Or on the right, the Battle of Kasserine Pass, where we had seen everything playing out with the Blitzkrieg. We'd done the testing. We just couldn't bring it all together into an effective manner, in particular when it came to command and control. So with that, I'll end by saying there's massive changes that are going on in everything from technology to geopolitics. Individuals, organizations, and nations that don't embrace that change, but instead stay still, are choosing to lose the future through their inaction. And I hope none of us do that. Thank you.
All right. Well, that was terrific. I love the sacred cow, and I absolutely agree with you in the sentiment. So that was a great overview. Next, we're going to turn to the Air Force's own Major Michael Cannon. He's up at MIT, and I did want to mention for those watching on YouTube and Facebook, we have people monitoring the chats there. So if you want to put questions and comments in there, we'll get those transferred over. But without that, turn it over to Michael.
Thanks, Dr. Mulvaney. And Peter, embracing change just enough not to change might be my new favorite quote. So thank you to the team at CASI and to the other panelists here today for the event. But in addition to that, to the leaders listening now, very personally and humbly, for the opportunity to share and for the real practical work to get us the on-ramps to the road that lies ahead. We're talking about China today, but how we respond is a theme I think you'll see characterized in the conversation. So much of our success hinges on the conditions we set. And frankly, it wasn't long ago, many of these topics were mere afterthoughts, just a bunch of sprinkles. I'd like to begin by going back in time to 2018, January specifically, 3.5 years ago. And what was happening then? Well, the book Fire and Fury just released. An errant ballistic missile warning was sent to Hawaii. Of course, it was canceled 38 minutes later. Al Franken resigned. In AI world, it was the first time that the Google CEO compared AI to electricity and fire. They had just removed images of gorillas from its data labeling platform, sparking huge conversations on bias and fairness of AI in everyday dialogue. And it wasn't even commonly known that Google was partnering with the DoD on Maven. Employees had yet to sign their open letter. 3.5 years ago feels like a lifetime. In the fast-paced world we live now, it is a lifetime. But more than that too. On January 3rd in 2018, news release from Chairman Xi's New Year's address with the picture of the book, The Master Algorithm, strategically placed behind him. You see, this was all just 4 months on the heels of Putin's infamous, but often misunderstood words that AI is the future not only for Russia, but for all of humankind. It comes with colossal opportunities, but also threats that are difficult to predict. Whoever becomes leader in this sphere will become ruler of the world. Was that just some clairvoyant moment? Was he just offering commentary and forecast? Was he making a call to action then to energize his own population? I don't think so. It was beyond that. It was a statement to other statesmen, a confirmation that he and his government were awake and aware to a sophisticatedly deep effort underway to accomplish a new world order. It was because only a month earlier from that, China had released its massive 3-part strategy aimed at achieving very clear benchmarks of advances in AI. First, by 2020, that's a year ago now, China planned to match the highest levels of AI technology and application capabilities in the US or anywhere in the world. 2025, they intend to capture a verifiable lead in the development and production of core AI tech. And as we all know, by 2030, they intend to dominantly lead all countries in all aspects and related fields of AI. To be the sole leader, the world's unquestioned and controlling epicenter of it all. With all this said, authoritarian leaders and countries were recognizing it wasn't any longer defensible to incubate AI innovations for longer than the shortest time necessary, to no longer slow walk AI efforts, but rollouts were requisite. And this was a chance to leapfrog and seize markets and more in ways unlike ever before. While all this was going on, we were still just weeks away from even coining the term great power competition in a strategy essentially meant to inform our decision-making in the 18 to 23 budgets. Still living under the guise that yesterday's requirements are the solutions to today's needs. 3.5 years ago. And since then, those words have been bandied about, intended to spark change, but more often causing us to admire the problem at hand, to lean on those crutch words at a national scale to somehow say a lot without saying anything at all. I was thinking the other day, if someone had a nickel for every time I heard the term great power competition or an Ethereum token or Dogecoin, just how wealthy would someone be? It's this that should give us pause. Because back in 2018, and even before, it was conveyed quite clearly that in just 5 years, China catches up in AI, among other things. Well, surprise, it's 2021. So where are we? What's characteristically different? What is government and business and in our personal lives, what have we done pragmatically, practically to change, to get beyond words and nice to-dos? Because it's not hard to know what the DoD is doing, what it values, and what it prioritizes. Simply look at the budget. It's not a secret. What needs to be accomplished and what hasn't been done are trade-offs and action in response to the changing world. Just a willingness to make a trade and do something different. We can all pay lip service to where we want to go as a nation, as businesses, as a DoD, and everyone says and knows, oh, we want to shrink our OODA loops. We want to communicate at machine speed. Everything will be AI enabled. But if we want meaningful change to steer the big boat, pump oil into the machine, one would imagine things look different than what we're planning for now. But unfortunately, it all looks too much the same as it did a decade ago. In fact, in many ways, it's going the wrong direction. Here are some facts, not alternative facts, that I know Pete is also quite familiar with too. The most recent defense appropriations bill for FY21 allocated 3 times the money for aircraft, ship, vehicle, and depot maintenance than cyber, 38 billion to 10. 17 billion going to fuel and 780 million going to cloud. 13 billion went to 96 joint strike fighters and 840 million went to AI and 450 to 5G. Do those numbers sound right? Just what conflict do we think we're in and heading for? Now look, if the vision is overmatch in physical combat systems, overwhelming air, land, and sea power, then fine. We reap the seeds we sow. To a certain degree, at least, we'd be marching forward to the same beat of the same drum. But we don't say things like that. Because I don't think anyone with a straight face can say, oh, that budget looks right. Or yes, that is the plan. I'm also not saying we don't have to deal with legacy and aging equipment, that we don't need fuel to project power. But to what degree is the hard and needed conversation? We love to talk a lot about the top of the proverbial stack, the cool stuff, the Ender's games, what the Chinese Communist Party is doing. But the building blocks are dwindling afterthoughts, continuously traded down, not being risk averse, but risk blind, and left for someone else to one day figure out. These are grandiose problems at hand. How do we fix it? What game do competitors want us to play? Should we out-China China? What's conflict nowadays? Well, this is where the rubber hits the road, where the meat of the conversation should be. A fundamental reality is that everything is different. And new realities require new ideas. And we're trying to fit square pegs in round holes, but we need to do the hard work of carving out some new square holes. The landscape is changing while we're suiting up to play one game. Others might be suiting up to play another. The concern at hand is that in a practical sense, that we come to a realization one day in a moment of need that there is a game being played that we kept our eyes closed to. And in real world consequences, it means we can't pivot to deal with the variables. You see, what's happening is our instruments of power, ranging from diplomatic, that's your embassies, treaties, et cetera, to informational, which we see a sharp, disconcerting rise of that I'll get to in a moment, to military, that's us, show of force, deterrence, usual, which we use to essentially answer everything and isn't getting us much, especially in inaccessible areas and beyond long campaigns, and the E of course, economic. They're all blending in ways not necessarily by nature new, but in concert make something different. Just this weekend, we had a glimpse of what the future could be. Homeland strategic pipelines held up by essentially nefarious small-time actors. Solar winds before that, Sony in North Korea, the list goes on. To this point, the information pillar stretches across all the other instruments on a scale a little bit unlike before. Like the eye and the dime model should be the foundation of DME nowadays. The future, what the Chinese Communist Party are doing, what Russia does, and plans moving forward is best summed up, I think, in what Hannah Arendt said. A people that can no longer believe anything cannot make up its mind. It's deprived not only of its capacity to act, but also of its capacity to think and to judge. And with such people, you can do what you please. That axiom holds true in both domestic and foreign policy. Of course, the creation, distribution, and the use of disinformation and information at this accessibility is something we've never witnessed because it's nothing new, but this domain is undoing so many other instruments. And we have to get back to thinking about them in the context of this new reality. The question of what is real, what's truth, can I trust, do I agree, do I want to? Those will underpin the hardest conversations of this generation. And if you ask me, that's the game being played, and we're missing seeing the forest through the trees. The Department of Defense has a real role to play in this. This too will compromise us in operations. In the end, the Chinese Communist Party and their complex doesn't have better AI. I mean, we're talking about essentially in modern day machine learning, 4 types, a dozen or so techniques, the same number of algorithms themselves. It's math and code mixed with innovation and human ingenuity to see the world through the lens of AI. It's all publicly available. Just go to GitHub. What's going on is that they're not only fully experiencing AI in their everyday life, military and geopolitical pursuits, they're executing legitimately digital operations in all its varieties. Even if in a traditional warfighting sense, they do remain behind us. They're practicing, and their export of authoritarianism in a tech box very recursively backpropagates, pun intended, to informing more advancements. It's their give a dang and making it real that's real. While we still say it's just an age of great power competition. The solution then is that each of us in the defense sphere, the citizenry, internalize a sense of responsibility to be part of changing the system, playing our own special roles in the bigger machine and taking pride in setting an environment where the leaders of tomorrow can pivot and succeed. They can make choices. So in closing, we have to ask ourselves, when I lament about data, did I call the program office or the requirements person to convey what it is I need? That's your responsibility. That's our responsibility. While we wait around for cloud, who cares? When cloud comes, is your data machine readable? Are you preparing it for cloud native deployments? What about those companies you'd like to work with? Did you call someone or ask, are you doing a commercial acquisition so I can work with them? Or are we just being bystanders? From newest sessions, from the flight line to the 4-star, do you know how machine learning works, what the process is? Or are we feigning understanding to get through 5 minutes of conversation? An airman, a soldier, a sailor, a marine, a guardian alone working the mission doesn't have the answer. Similarly, the 4-star doesn't have the answer. The acquisitions professional doesn't have the answer. The lawyer doesn't have the answer. The engineer, the coder, they too don't have the answer. But if they're in the same room, if someone just picks up a phone, together they do have an answer. That's what creates success in the digital age. That's how we keep up. This is the state of play. I hope the takeaway is that the AI Ender's Game stories, the heroes of lore, they probably won't be us. It'll be the next group. But that's why we're here, to help catalyze those stories with the tough, not fun legwork right now. I'm personally inspired by that. And if we have understanding today, it drives the conversations of tomorrow. So thank you for the opportunity and look forward to the questions and dialogue ahead.
Terrific, thanks for that. Very useful in kind of helping frame where we are, where we got to go, and kind of what's next. So I'm sure there's going to be a ton of questions coming out of that one. So now shifting across the road from MIT, going over to Harvard, we have Elsa, who we're also very pleased is not only a CNAS fellow, but a CASI fellow. So we will turn it over to her for her presentation.
Thank you. Good afternoon, all, and hope you are well, safe, and staying healthy. And yeah, I'm honored to be joining this conversation with so many colleagues who I respect so highly. And yeah, I think this is certainly quite a moment to be trying to make sense of these trends and the world as it is. And I'd actually start with the framing of the concept that I think highlights elements of how the CCP sees the world today, the notion of profound changes unseen in a century. The idea that Xi Jinping has raised and that has been reaffirmed as a core assessment by the party of the world today highlights that we're at a moment of disruption in geopolitics, including with a shift towards greater multipolarity in the world and dynamics of power transition, a shift from west to east by their view, including with US decline, at least relatively speaking. And I think a core component of those profound changes is also, as you've already been hearing this afternoon, about the notion of a fourth industrial revolution underway, and the notion that such new industrial revolution presents the possibility for really significant transformation of the world as we know it. And certainly, I'm repeating some of the themes from my colleagues here. I think it won't be a surprise to anyone to think about the disruption, transformation. Those are terms and concepts we toss about quite a bit and trying to make sense of where we are and where things are going with these technologies. But I think the belief of the CCP is also that with those changes and with this new industrial revolution, unlike in the past, China is poised in a position where there's the opportunity to be a first mover, even a leader. And this reflects to a core concept, relates to a core concept in Chinese strategy, even ideology, the notion of an innovation-driven strategy for development. The fact that in historical perspective, the rise and fall of great powers has been influenced, even determined to some extent, by their prowess or relative advances in science and technology. And previously in its history, when China failed to keep pace with the technologies of the time, it fell prey to predation by foreign powers. It was beset by backwardness, so-called century of humiliation. And I think that historical memory and legacy and concerns about a generation gap, sort of a sense both of threat looking at US programs and initiatives, but also a sense of opportunity. And that when it comes to technologies like artificial intelligence, comes to today's emerging technologies and strategic industries as well, there's also a chance for China to be among the first movers, to be starting from the same point or close to it. And I think also recognition, as you heard from my colleague at MIT, about the openness of science in this domain and the fact that efforts to control, such as by the United States, or to maintain technological dominance will be inherently challenged by the structure of the innovation ecosystem in the world today. And I think there can sometimes be a tension or contradiction when we talk about notions of great power competition, in that uniquely within artificial intelligence, the US and China are clearly competing. If you look at the plans and policies and the claims by each capital to want to lead in the strategic technology, and yet at the same time, when you look at research and development within academia, there continues to be a great deal of integration and collaboration, and often mutually beneficial in some respects. And we can talk about concerns over IP theft and tech transfer, and talk about how to ensure research security and integrity when it comes to those collaborations. But I would posit that as we are thinking about this competition from an American perspective and trying to think about what is our core comparative advantage, I think the fact that we are more positioned to draw upon this openness, and that our leadership does require the sustainment of commitment to international collaboration. And I think with that comes also requires a recognition that we can't perhaps control the trajectory of developments in AI as we might hope, and especially given how much of this is driven by academia and commercial enterprises. So I think there is that tension again between open science and competition, the sense of possibility and also perils of falling behind that are driving what some would characterize as an arms race. And I tend to reject the notion that we are in an AI arms race, because I think the stakes are far, far higher. And what's at stake is far, far graver than military superiority alone. And again, I think the notion of the transformation of the world order as we see it, and the profound changes that the CCP believes are underway, really also speak to the balance economically. And although we often approach US-China rivalry through the lens of national defense and security and are concerned about the military balance around the Taiwan Strait or advances in hypersonic weaponry. I think fundamentally the foundations of our national strength and the foundation of China's rise as well has been economics. And I think while we've been focused and often do in these conversations on what AI may mean for the future of warfare, I think the potential economic ramifications may be far more significant. And I think in this respect, when we talk about innovation, certainly being at the cutting edge in advances in algorithms and techniques and breakthroughs is exciting, but fundamentally the capacity to generate value and contribute to growth and productivity is really critical element of that as well that we can't overlook, and that certainly the Chinese government hasn't, and their focus on building up an AI industry and this tension between, again, a apparent contradiction between what can be seen perhaps too simplistically sometimes as a state-driven approach driven by the central government, and certainly there are objectives and priorities for investment set, again, and attention to AI from Xi Jinping himself repeatedly calling this a strategic technology and emphasizing its importance to gain the initiative. I think there's also not just the call to action, as with the 2017 AI plan, which I'd recommend reading in full for those who hadn't. I'd been among those who worked on an initial translation of it. And I think when you look through the plan itself, beyond the headlines of wanting to lead the world, you do see that it is very methodological description of different applications of AI across different domains, different disciplines and intersections of AI with other emerging technologies, whether that is life sciences and biotechnology or quantum technology, as we'll be discussing on our next panel. And I think there is a lot of significance as to looking at the growth of China's digital economy. And while China may not have a data advantage that is universal or generalizable, certainly when it comes to starting to bring AI applications into the real world and into people's day-to-day lives, I think China certainly is proving to be an early adopter. And whether that is self-driving vehicles or surveillance systems or even some of the advances we saw in pandemic response using AI, whether for disease surveillance, enhancing diagnostics and research, or providing more early warning and tracking of contacts. So there are elements, I think, of China's relative success, however caveated it should be, in responding to COVID-19, including the leveraging of emerging technologies and the efforts of technology companies to that end that are significant. And the objective then articulated by Chinese leaders to be the first to control the pandemic, return to work, and achieve positive economic growth do appear to have achieved, again, a success, at least relatively speaking. And I think although we sometimes talk about the future abstractly, we sometimes overlook just how profoundly we are seeing it changing around us day by day, again, with the impact of the pandemic on our economies, our societies, our militaries, and global geopolitics. So I think our understanding of security in this moment does have to continue to evolve and take into account the really systemic threats that we are facing today. I think certainly there is plenty occurring in terms of military developments here as well, and it's hardly surprising to see that to some degree in response to and learning from or adapting elements of US approaches to harness AI, the People's Liberation Army has launched intelligentization as a priority in its military strategy and modernization in its own right. It was highlighted again in the 14th five-year plan. It's a priority for integrated development along with mechanization and informatization, these three stages of military modernization, and each geared towards developing those capabilities within the PLA's overall system of systems, and also preparing for the intelligent warfare that is believed to be on the horizon today. And again, a sense of insecurity from Chinese leaders and looking to mitigate the risks of technology surprise, the fears of falling behind, concern with, and perhaps overestimation of American capabilities and advancements in some cases, but also a sense of that in in this revolution in military affairs, as the PLA sees it, intelligentization and integrating AI for a range of applications across the system of systems, it's really fundamental and foundational to the future of military power. And here too, while China's rise continues and is enabled by its economy, and the PLA seeks to become a world-class military in turn in its own right, investments in these new frontiers of technology and capabilities in a manner that is integrated with economic development, including through a national strategy of military-civil fusion, really the crux upon which this future rivalry will hinge going forward. And we can discuss, or it would take a far longer conversation to get into detail on the different elements of research, development, and experimentation that is occurring within Chinese military research institutions, through academic partnerships, within technology companies, even startups, in a range of contests and competitions using AI, everything from wargaming to cyber and aerospace capabilities to experimenting with swarming, has been one of the more visible advances so far, certainly. And I think every service of the PLA, many major research institutions are quite actively pursuing and experimenting with these capabilities, and Chinese military strategists in turn are in the process of developing new concepts of operations, looking to leverage these technologies going forward. So I think certainly a lot to track, and I would argue that as we think about great power competition, as has been highlighted as a character of the international environment we find ourselves in today, that a nuanced understanding and granular assessments of our rivals is really critical to how we navigate the road ahead, and how we also recognize some of the risks that may arise with militaries racing and sometimes seemingly perhaps over-exuberant about the potential of relatively untested technologies that may convey new risks. So certainly questions about AI safety and security, reliability, risks of accidents or unintended escalation. Just I'd say in closing, I think while I share my colleagues' optimism about our agency, the potential, the capacity to step up, to lead, adapt, and transform ourselves, I think we also have to be mindful of the risks ahead and look to mitigate those as best we can, including through engaging pragmatically with our competitors and ensuring that our own competitive strategies are informed to the best of our ability by an understanding of the active advances from other states that recognize the same opportunities we do, which I think will hopefully segue into a perspective on what's happening on Russia as well from my next colleague. But I really appreciate the chance to join this conversation today, and I look forward to your questions and continuing the conversation.
All right, terrific. Well, thank you very much for that. I'm sure there's going to be a ton of questions about the PLA and exactly what they're doing with it. And I'll have a couple things to say here at the end, but not here to listen to me at this moment. We're going to turn it over for, like Elsa's already said, a Russian perspective and how they see and are using AI in great power competition. So we're going to turn it over to Mr. Samuel Bendet from CNA. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mulvaney, and thank you for CASI for hosting this event. I truly appreciate being part of this debate, and I really appreciate following so many esteemed colleagues and such excellent discussion that sets the premise for what I'm going to discuss about the Russian Federation. I think this debate will be served best if I just paint an overall major, or rather an overarching picture of where Russian society and military are today with respect to development and fielding of artificial intelligence. What's interesting is that Russia has always considered itself to be a STEM superpower. That is a science, technology, engineering, and mathematics epicenter, one of the best global environments in which such learning actually thrived. And certainly that was the case in the Cold War, when STEM education served the state, served the military, and often drew the best and the brightest for the best available resources. Of course, after the end of the Cold War, Russian institutions, Russian academia, and other parts of society suffered greatly due to lack of resources and reallocation of resources and really different types of priorities that were instituted by the government. However, even in that trying time, Russian STEM institutions and its STEM backbone remain very strong, and it does remain strong to this very day. And so Russian AI discussion and debate really got a major jumpstart with the adoption of the national AI strategy back in the October of 2019, when the Russian government issued a set of principles and rules that should guide the national artificial intelligence development. I should state that that official document was actually concentrating on the civilian sector, and that the Russian military actually has its own AI research, development, testing, and evaluation priorities, white papers, and major principles. And so the national AI strategy served as the backbone for the National Artificial Intelligence Federal Project. That is the Russian government instituting sets of principles, guidelines, opening up institutions, various academic efforts, private sector efforts, funding efforts to develop the artificial intelligence research, development, testing, and evaluation ecosystem. And so beginning with early 2020, we've seen an exponential growth in different types of initiatives and discussions and debates within the Russian government and the Russian society. It should also be noted that Russian AI effort overall is a state-funded effort that, in contrast to a very robust public sector and, private sector effort, as well as a number of very significant private sector initiatives in China, most of Russian artificial intelligence efforts and funding actually comes from the state. And so the state plays an overwhelming share in the development of academic AI, civilian AI, private sector AI, in providing funding for these initiatives, as well as obviously for providing funding for the military and other efforts as well. Especially when it comes to academia, the state has the absolutely overwhelming and key share, simply because many of the Russia's top schools, universities, and colleges have the name federal and state in it, and so in them rather. And so Russian state is the overwhelming actor and the most important funder in the development of AI in the Russian society. At the same time, we're also seeing the budding private sector effort. Certain private sector companies are also growing out of this ecosystem that the Russian government is trying to institute, is trying to facilitate. The Russian government is trying to take a page out of very successful US, Israeli, and Asian efforts in fostering AI ecosystem. It is trying to sort of inject the flexibility and resourcefulness that the Russian state isn't normally famous for when it comes to the growth of artificial intelligence ecosystem. The AI ecosystem is also growing in parallel with Russia's general information and communication technologies ecosystem and its various efforts, which are now becoming global and rather famous. But at the same time, a lot of what the Russian government has launched is relatively new. So I think if we're trying to judge where Russian AI development is today, I would say it is still too early to see where Russian artificial intelligence development is. A lot of the initiatives, a lot of funding, a lot of the efforts, a lot of government programs, a lot of efforts that bridge academia and the public sector, state and the private sector, state and the military are still relatively young. At the same time, Russian government thinks of itself as sort of locked in a three-way race, where United States and China occupy the first place, and Russia is somewhere in third place, but in a relatively comfortable position to observe all of the major trends and adopt them. One of the most significant developments in the Russian AI ecosystem is the effort to bring AI and information technology, communication, education in general to the young people in Russia, sort of growing out the next generation of workers, of high-tech competent workers, the next cadre, the next AI-enabled workforce. And so Russian government thinks that that effort should start really early. And so we're seeing a tremendous amount of different types of competitions, hackathons, and contests taking place basically at the middle school level all the way up to the university level. The Russian government and its society understand that they cannot be locked in a one-on-one race with the United States and China. Russia simply doesn't have that much money, that much funding. But what it does have, once again, is a very competent, STEM-educated future and current workforce. And it is that STEM education that is the pride of the Russian government. In fact, Vladimir Putin spoke multiple times about the development of artificial intelligence in his country, and he stated the STEM education and the STEM background of Russia's young people as basically one of the facilitators and one of the major factors that would allow Russia to indeed become one of the major artificial intelligence players globally in the near future. Again, a lot of the efforts that the Russian government has instituted are relatively young, and we cannot yet judge their success. But at the same time, we can look at where Russian military and Russian defense industrial sector see the role of artificial intelligence. Much like in the United States, much like in China, and much like in other advanced countries and societies around the world, the Russian government sees artificial intelligence as a decision-making enabler for the military. That is a tool that would be able to analyze vast quantities of data in order to give the most optimal outcome for a human operator. Russian military talks about AI as a human in the loop and a human on the loop approach. They discuss the importance and significance of a human factor in the development of military autonomy, military robotics, as well as other major AI-enabled systems. What is actually important for the Russian military is the move from the current digitization drive, that is the introduction of the ever-increasing number of high-tech and ICT elements in the military, to the intellectualization of the Russian military. That is where digitization essentially morphs into technologies, systems, and principles that would incorporate artificial intelligence and machine learning elements into the Russian military. Sort of a military that moves from a human in the loop and the human constant to one where humans are basically setting tasks for various types of AI-enabled military systems for them to accomplish those tasks themselves. And so we're seeing a lot of artificial intelligence and machine learning tests taking place across the Russian military in the autonomy, in the robotics. We're also seeing a lot of AI discussed and applied in C4ISR, that is command, control, communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. And so we're seeing the discussion of Russian military using AI in early warning radars, in electronic warfare, in information warfare, cyber operations, in counter UAV efforts, and many, many other efforts. Artificial intelligence in the military is also discussed in the nuclear context, in the nuclear warning context, as well as other supporting efforts in the military, such as AI in medicine and artificial intelligence for logistics and other operations. So the Russian military is investing heavily in the development of artificial intelligence by also creating its own ecosystem, by launching efforts such as Advanced Research Foundation, which is Russia's DARPA-like organization, its ERA Tech City, tapping the defense industrial giants like Rostec and others to develop artificial intelligence for weapons and systems, as well as reaching out to the academia and the state in order to develop certain dual-use technologies or joint projects. What's interesting about this is that most of Russian and Chinese cooperation in artificial intelligence takes place on the civilian side. So starting with 2015 and 2016, there have been multiple efforts, high-level efforts and high-level discussions and announcements between the Russian and Chinese governments on opening up technoparks, setting up various academic efforts, creating joint funding organizations, and many other initiatives that would combine Russia's STEM-educated workforce and academia with Chinese funding and Chinese expertise. Russia understands that it cannot truly match what China is doing, but Russian government, and especially its major elements like the Russian Academy of Sciences, have stated on multiple occasions that Russia should and must learn from China in commercializing ideas, in taking ideas from the blackboard all the way to the finished product. And so Russian and Chinese cooperation is exemplified by multiple statements and efforts, such as the announcement that this year, the 2021, will be the year of bilateral Chinese-Russian technical cooperation. Russia and China also work together on artificial intelligence development and other high-tech efforts within the BRICS format that Russia chaired last year. But one of the most important sort of elements and examples of Chinese success in bilateral AI cooperation are its private sector companies, such as Huawei, that have spent several years investing in Russian academia, in its STEM-educated workforce, investing in companies, and trying to help Russia develop its artificial intelligence ecosystem, where young people can not only get the required education, but also be able to exercise freedom of thought and freedom of development in order to take, again, their ideas public into a commercial product. What's interesting about this bilateral cooperation is that it itself is also relatively recent. And so a lot of announcements made several years ago haven't exactly resulted in actual concrete products. But what we do have are efforts at the highest level and promises at the highest level of both governments that this cooperation will go forward. Russia sees itself as one of the emerging AI superpowers. Russia sees its STEM-educated workforce as a major facilitator of this effort. And Russia believes that with a proper amount of funding and with enough flexibility and with enough belief and trust from its society, that it can in fact use and incorporate artificial intelligence in most of the elements across the country and become one of the key developers of artificial intelligence technology and elements in the near future. I look forward to answering more of your questions and inquiries in the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
All right, terrific. So with that, that concludes the introductory remarks from the panelists. We're going to go ahead and go to the panel view. I did want to make a couple of comments, though, about just specifically about the PLA and why they're focused on artificial intelligence, in my personal opinion, right? And again, the standard disclaimer goes for all the participants. They're all speaking in a personal capacity, so we'll just state that right up front. But it goes kind of to the crux of what it means to be a Communist Party member. So the Chinese, I like to tell people, are good communists. And what I mean by that is they understand the world through the lens of communism, because this is how they've been taught. And it takes a very scientific approach to the world. And that's why when we look at Chinese military documents, it's the science of campaigns. It's the science of this, the science of that. Because they, at their heart, believe that things are knowable. At the end of the day, if you collect enough data, if you get enough information, and you can analyze it correctly, then things are knowable. And this, I think, really feeds into their whole drive for big data, big computing, which we'll talk about next in quantum, but also then feeds into their AI efforts, because they think that if you could write that right algorithm, you can solve that problem. And so this is really why the Chinese are fascinated by this, and why they continue to use AI in many ways that, as we already heard, are at least on par with, if not in advance of, where the U.S. is using it. Samuel made a good comment there about, the man, is the man on the loop, is the man in the loop, or is the man just somewhere around the loop? And this is an open debate. There's probably going to be multiple answers depending on who you ask and how things develop. I personally believe that the PLA, they would be perfectly happy if they could get AI to run the world, because then you could, as long as you can write the right algorithm, you can make sure it's 100% politically reliable. It's all these darn humans that get in the way, that you got to worry about their feelings and things like that. And it's really something that they are more, in my opinion, going to be more likely to turn over to an AI sooner rather than later. Whereas I think the United States, just from our values and our ethics, are going to want, a man on the loop, a human making the decision, especially when it comes to taking the lives of another human. We may let, machines fight it out at machine speed when it's just cyber battles or over things like that. But if it's actually putting weapons on a target where people are going to be losing their lives, I think that's something that the U.S. probably going to be a little bit, I don't want to say behind, but to take a different tack than the PLA is going to be able to do or going to want to do. So, so with that, we've already got a couple questions. So again, if you're watching on Facebook, if you're watching on YouTube, or here obviously on Zoom, please just go ahead and type in your questions. We'll get them to the presenters. I will remove my pin, so hopefully we can. Let's see if we can get. I'll worry about the full screen gallery view here. There we go. So the first question comes kind of back to just a general. Hey, how are we doing this? Because this is all about great power competition, right? So competition is the theme today. So one of the questions was, do you think that we need to start to curtail China's AI advancement? And if so, there was a couple different possibilities: increasing our own AI funding, leveraging TSMC, et cetera, et cetera. So I will turn it over to the panelists. I'll let anyone talk about how you think. One, should we? Two, is it possible? And three, if so, what are the mechanisms we would use? So I'll turn it over to you guys.
Sure, I can share a couple of initial thoughts on that front. And I think the first would be that in some respects, we've already started. And certainly from Beijing's perspective, we have been not only pursuing containment geopolitically, but also attempting to contain the rise technologically, especially when it comes to exploiting bottlenecks and choke points like access to semiconductors. And certainly when denying chips to Huawei brought a flagship company that was a national champion in some respects, more or less to its knees at one point. I think that very much reinforced to China's leaders the vulnerability that came with their dependence upon American semiconductors. And I think we can say at this point that that may be regarded as an example where our attempts to control or constrain China's technological development, or in particular that of Huawei, backfired insofar as there already were long-standing attempts to develop indigenous semiconductors. The trajectory of those efforts in the long term is still uncertain. It is challenging to catch up in something that is so complex and requires so much expertise and even some of the tacit knowledge of managing and producing semiconductors that ways in which TSMC is relatively unrivaled in this domain, I think are certainly provide advantages that can be hard to erode. And certainly, I think we shouldn't assume that China will catch up and develop chips to rival those it had depended upon just because of the desire to do so. But certainly we have seen dramatic resourcing to that agenda, as well as poaching of talent, theft of IP, really scaling up of these efforts with the objective to achieve technological self-reliance, which is really a byword in the 14th five-year plan. And I think, again, whether technological self-reliance and wholly indigenous innovation is feasible in a world that is integrated and in which supply chains are very interconnected, I think that does remain to be seen. But I think that there is a risk of attempts to control or constrain technologies backfiring. I think semiconductors is an easy example in some respects because it is more discrete. We're talking about hardware, not software. When we turn to thinking about AI, however one scopes AI for the purposes of a conversation, I think traditional instruments like export controls aren't wholly appropriate. And as we've heard in the course of the conversation, artificial intelligence is quite open in the research and applications. It's often open source and available freely for anyone who wants to leverage the tools and algorithms and resources out there in the space already. So I think, so I am skeptical of our prospects to control or constrain the development of AI without fundamentally restructuring the conduct of research in ways that would be detrimental to the United States going forward. We have seen pragmatic measures like some of the reforms around investment screening through FIRMA. We've seen more export controls focused on end users, trying to have more targeted measures to constrain certain core technologies. But I think my preference and recommendation would be that I think ultimately the US competes best by remaining more open and sustaining the openness of our innovation ecosystem going forward. And that I think we have limited capacity in a world of global science to fully constrain or contain China's rise technologically. I think trying could cause collateral damage, and I think nonetheless there are some of these more targeted measures that are feasible that we should continue to explore and experiment with.
That's great. Peter, I see your hand up, and I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on this. I read Burn In, which I thought was a fantastic book just to read. But the fact that all of the things you use in the book are already here and available today makes me very interested in if you think we can keep the genie in the bottle.
So I wanted to align myself very much with what Elsa raised. You know, the question framed it as do you think we need to curtail China's AI advancement? But then it laid out a series of actions that some of them you would put in the category of curtail or control, and then other ones were about enhancing our own capability. And on the curtail side, and I think this echoes what Elsa was saying, I think I'll put it this way. I think I've seen a lot of writing out of the academic, in particular think tank community, and out of the some members of the prior White House that had this assumption that China as a static actor that is somehow unaware that it had these vulnerabilities or that it was behind, and so was both unaware of it and doing nothing about it, and so therefore we could control it. It's a little bit of the parallel you used to have the discourse. A lot of people remember, well, China can't make, advanced aircraft. They need those from the Russians, and they realized that and they worked on it. I point to, in particular, one of the interesting things, and I have to credit some other people in the OSINT crowd who have examined research papers published in some of the key EUV academic conferences. And if you track the numbers coming out of China, they basically stop circa around like 2017, 2018. So you either have to think, oh, suddenly everyone in China just stopped doing that research, or obvious answer, the government both increased it and said, hey, you need to stop presenting at international conferences. So I think the Pottinger White House sort of theory, but also some think tank land that somehow, again, there's the difference between saying we need to try and curtail, but having the assumption that it's a static actor that's unaware of its vulnerability. And guess what? This is all you can do. That's it. That's on the curtail side. The flip side, the other side of it is us. How do we compete better? And that's everything from looking back at the Cold War parallels of why were we so successful? It was because of everything from us investing in science and technology at the basic and the applied research level to us having open immigration and drawing in some of the world's best talent who are doing everything from working on our government and military programs to founding pretty much every single successful American technology company. So if you are trying to stop that, congratulations, you are doing the work of China. To aligning with allies. One of the gain, so we put it in the frame of how is US versus China doing in AI. A better framing would be how is the US, EU, Japan, Australia all together doing vis-a-vis China? Well, that doesn't happen unless you approach it multilaterally. So again, that's my take on it, is that we need to go after it in a very smart and manner. A manner that reflects the lessons of the past, and a manner that assumes that we are dealing with an adversary who is cognizant and self-aware.
No, that's a great point, and it actually it leads well to comments by either Michael or Samuel if they have something to add. But my question to Samuel is kind of dovetailing on that would be, so we're talking about the U.S. trying to contain China. But what do we see Russia and China cooperating on? One would assume that if the U.S. tried to step in, that Russia would see that as an opportunity and would able to collaborate with them or to leverage their relationship there to kind of circumvent whatever the U.S. try to do. Thoughts on that?
That's a great question. The current bilateral cooperation concentrates mostly on civilian sector. such as medicine, such as education, academia, such as industrial production, and other elements. So we're not yet seeing any official statement from either country that they will cooperate specifically on military AI. But obviously, Sino-Russian military cooperation is definitely a thing. It has been growing recently, and it is probably going to continue to grow. So at some point, we will probably see official statements from both countries confirming that they are in fact working on artificial intelligence, for example, in robotics, early warning, missile warning systems, and other military elements. But again, for now, most statements coming from both countries has been confirmation of their strength in a bilateral relationship in the face of the pandemic and the assistance, the high-tech assistance they've given to each other over the past year.
That's great. Michael is one of those guys that's up there at MIT doing exactly what Peter Singer kind of laid out and what Elsa mentioned, of course, trying to strengthen our own. What are your thoughts and perspectives on A, how it's going, and B, what do we see as the, I don't want to say maybe the influence or the relationship of China with the academic community? Obviously, there was a little kerfuffle with some of the research funding that's going up in Boston. Thoughts on that?
I think to echo this is the world isn't binary. Ones and zeros, yes or no, doesn't work. To the point on curtailing technology, I think it is wildly naive and relatively disingenuous to a certain degree when we just say ban Huawei, ban Baidu. I mean, if it was 2006, yeah, maybe that would have been a thing. But we live in a world where we have to operate where that technology is in existence. And for us just to say, across the pond, ban it, that's not working with your partners who are using it, right? Who are going to use these things. And we have to demonstrate the value in making trade-offs for the capabilities they might get from a Chinese technology, understanding its repressive nature, what it could do, and how it reinforms back to their underlying core tech versus, no, we have to offer you something different. So in addition to the semiconductor, point, we let that industry go. That was, a decision we made decades ago. We probably shouldn't have. I hope we're inspired recently that we might want to create some more fabs. Now, in terms of a point that I thought was really crucial that Peter said is the value of people who are immigrants and people who are researchers and people who are by and large means genuine Americans who care about what we do. Sitting here at MIT, we have a very, very diverse, inclusive group of people working on Air Force AI problems while simultaneously advancing the fundamental research in the interests of MIT and AI for a public good, which is what we do here at the MIT AI Accelerator. So I would just highlight that opening the gates and demonstrating our values and having people who come here to work with us is probably the most crucial thing that we could do. And I'm glad to see an uptick in that sentiment and a changing tide.
Great. So next question is really for Elsa and Samuel. How is AI currently being used in wargaming, simulation, realism, those kinds of things from the PLA and the Russian perspectives?
So I'd actually start by speaking of recent history that feels like a lifetime ago sometimes, by looking back to AlphaGo's defeat of Lee Sedol in the spring of 2016. So that was a milestone that generated a level of interest in the AI community, including because no one had anticipated that the game of Go could be conquered by AI so quickly. But within China, this moment had quite a bit of salience, generated headlines, and also provoked thinking on the utility of AI in future warfare among Chinese military scientists and strategists in particular. And the notion that an AI could beat a human in a game that is known to involve complex strategy and myriad possibilities hinted that perhaps AI could also have unique utility in future command decision making. And certainly a Go board is quite different from a battlefield, and a war game is quite a ways from the fog and friction of an actual operational environment. But the idea of an AlphaGo for warfare, or the idea of developing AI systems that could either contend with human decision makers or potentially engage in partnership with or integration with them as well. I think a lot of that can be traced to PLA's reaction to AlphaGo, and this actually provoked a lot of debate. Some of the early writings and concepts around intelligentization that I first started tracking at the time, I sort of directly cited this moment, and there have been efforts in wargaming underway, including at the PLA's National Defense University with folks like one of their main war game designers, Hu Xiafeng, who has repeatedly cited AlphaGo as an inspiration, and has also referenced often a DARPA program known as Deep Green that nobody I mentioned to a US audience has ever heard of, that has been closely studied by the PLA as a sort of earlier application of having a crystal ball to predict what the battlefield will look like, and a sketch and decide option for commanders. And I think certainly the idea of using AI to enhance human decision making has been a core priority. And wargaming has been one of the ways in which this has started to be tested. So just about a year and a half or so after AlphaGo's defeat of Lee Sedol, the Chinese Academy of Sciences Institute of Automation and a national wargaming competition debuted Prophet 1.0, an AI wargaming system that beat human players, I think, in 7-1 in some of the final rounds, or by a pretty high margin, all things considered. And this again, it was a milestone in the PLA's thinking on AI and the use of wargaming as a means of studying war, especially for the PLA as a force that is trying to learn and innovate during peacetime without recent combat experience. And there have been ongoing initiatives looking at more complex AI systems for use in wargaming, more complex scenarios, including joint operations, and using this as a virtual environment in which to test concepts, as well as a means of enhancing the realism of training. So there's a lot happening on this front, a lot of ongoing initiatives, and I think certainly an aspect of the field to watch. Certainly, and I don't think we're going to see AI in command tomorrow, but I think there is a great deal of interest in the possibilities that may come, and the use of simulations in wargaming as a means of generating data and starting to test out what is within the realm of the possible.
Back in 2018, Russian military announced that they are actually going to start utilizing artificial intelligence in wargaming. And although we haven't seen open source data and descriptions of war games utilizing artificial intelligence, what we have seen is the introduction of AI into various command and control drills and exercises that combine aerial, land, and other assets into sort of a single information stream, a Russian equivalent of their version of net-centric warfare. We've also seen artificial intelligence discussed as a major C4ISR element within the ERA technology city context, that is the Ministry of Defense managed high-tech innovation place on the Black Sea coast that combines military and civilian efforts to develop breakthrough technologies for the military and for the civilians. And we've also seen artificial intelligence discussed as a major C4ISR element in the context of the annual Army Expo that takes place every summer in Russia, where artificial intelligence is a major topic at roundtables, discussions, and debates, both classified and unclassified.
Yeah, no, that's great. So, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I do think I want to jump in here and take it one step further from, the AlphaGo analogy, which is like a crucial one. But one step further is we do have wargaming algorithms. The leading team play and strategy algorithms and techniques are done in a subset called reinforcement learning. They happen like many AI advancements in games. Those games, however, all publicly available, mind you, are now happening on StarCraft 2 and Dota as well. We're talking literal real-time strategy, top-down look with even the fog of war games. What we forget is that the successes there, which should be marked in the history of big successes in terms of AI outcompeting the human component, just happened recently. We celebrated that with DeepMind and OpenAI, but Tencent beat them to the punch a year earlier with T-Star Bots 1 and 2 themselves. Now, Is that playing out the complexities of warfare on a global scale? Certainly not. But when you're talking about the underlying simulated environment models, planes that are, those models themselves, like in StarCraft, are literally built off of Janes, right? Aircraft capabilities. And then you just plop down the South China Sea and you have somewhat of a prediction of what kind of assets everyone has. You can play that game a billion times, let the computer do it, and what you get are insights and techniques and ideas and strategies you didn't see before. I do believe that's going on right now. That's all publicly available, and it really illustrates the inherent duality to something that looks relatively benign. Let's advance reinforcement learning on games. Big companies do this. There's an interest in it because it's the same technique that you would use to deep fakes to detect breast cancer, right? That's important. We should advance those things. But it's the same techniques that also do stuff like play war games.
I would just add to that, I think it's important to pull out, why do we do war games? What is the reason for them? Why, when I say we, whether it's the US or even adversaries, and there's 4 essential goals with them, and we often forget in particular the 4th one. One is where you are essentially trying to judge likely outcomes of a real war, right? You're running the numbers, you're running the 2 teams to see, will we win or not? The second, and again, AI provides great value in that, and that you can run it literally millions of times, as opposed to just doing it that one time on the table at Naval War College or whatever. The second thing that you're doing in them is you are trying to hone skills. The participants gain skills at doing it in a way that simulates the real war. Different from that is the third, which is you are trying to learn new concepts, new approaches, different ways of going at it. That's what I was referencing, the difference between some of the, to put it bluntly, most of the wargaming and training exercises that the US does right now versus things like Louisiana maneuvers, fleet problem exercises back in the interwar years, coming up with something completely new and different. But the 4th and final reason for war games, which we forget, I think, too often, is you are trying to identify talent. You are trying to identify, of the participants, which ones are doing well, and then align back with that new concept side. It may be that people who, if we're coming at this with a new technology or a different approach, there may be both different individuals and or backgrounds that are thriving at this. So if you think back to the Louisiana maneuvers, you had well-tested, very capable US combat commanders who just couldn't deal with the speed of mechanization. And marshals going around taking notes around which officers are getting it intellectually. And here again, this may be something where AI helps us, because AI can also track the participants and how they are reacting, the speed of the decisions, however they get it right or wrong. You may be using your war game to find talent as well. It's a little bit of the parallel to what Michael was saying. That's Ender's Game, right? We're also moving that into finding who are the top people. So that's, I think we need to unpack when we say war games. What are we after with this?
And I'll just add on this last point that it's been fascinating to observe the popularization of wargaming as a component of China's national defense education since, again, 2017 or so, and even before for some of the smaller tournaments. They've been organizing a series of national wargaming competitions involving military players as well as civilian students from across China, sometimes upwards of 10,000 participating on a computerized wargaming platform in the course of a year. And then the national finals, as I mentioned, is a showcase for the top teams and top AI systems as well. So I think that last element of identifying talent, certainly within Chinese military institutions and beyond, some of the scope and level of interest in scaling up wargaming, I think, is significant along those lines as well, and gives really reinforces what Peter mentioned about the utility of this as a tool to identify talent and improve training, especially again for the PLA as a force that is that has seen personnel as among its weaknesses and has been concerned about cultivating skillful joint commanders going forward.
Well, and on the topic of talent, I wonder if you wanted to comment on how are we doing leveraging, the talent that's just resident here in the United States, specifically thinking, Silicon Valley, right? So how is the DoD cooperation with Silicon Valley? We were kind of late to the fight. We made some efforts, Project Maven, DIUX, all these kinds of things. Any sense of how well we're doing finding and leveraging the talent that exists in the US and then bringing that back in, or at least integrating it to the DoD?
I'll tell you one thing that I think really highlights what Sam was saying earlier, and consistently with what Sam shares, personally with me, which I always appreciate, Sam, by the way, is Russia's getting education right. Russia's getting STEM right. They're looking across the board. When it comes to our relationship with commercial industry, as being a part of it, a lot of that was overblown, right? That's clickbait. And there are a lot of reasons for that because people like reading those things. There is more that connects than divides us. And I think very rarely do I find somebody who's like, I don't even want to communicate with the Department of Defense, never will. Now, alternatively, on the flip from that though, I can think of no thing more American or democratic than saying, I don't want to work with the Department of Defense. That's awesome. That is the point. And we have to have meaningful conversations. Now, one thing that particularly being a military member that I think is obviously not intended, but most people say, well, how are we getting the talent? I don't have the talent. Where's the talent? And then they fail to look around and they fail to see that they are all around them and that we owe it to our military members, number one, to ask what types of things they do at home, because the citizen coder is a very real thing, especially in a new generation. And then furthermore, we have a role to play because this year the US will graduate 50,000 people with STEM-like degrees for 500,000 open jobs. But we live in a world where the barriers to education have never been lower. We shouldn't care if someone has a college degree or not. Have you done it? Can you do it? Do you have a passion to learn it? And the question is, how do we as a nation, particularly as the department, help drive down the gap nationally is what matters, because in only a few short years, there will be 1 million open jobs in the space. We have to reimagine what the job space is and who can fill them as well. We have a role in bridging the digital divide. I often talk about the need for something like a new National Defense Education Act that Peter was also mentioning, how we performed well in the things that we necessarily did to move forward during the Cold War era, which that was a significant portion of it back in 1958. And I think it's time for a renewed version of that. And then lastly, we just have to look at our force right now. I mean, I want to celebrate the Computer Language Initiative, in which we'll treat proficiency and aptitude in computer languages commensurately, so just the same as we do with human foreign languages. That's exciting. That is in the 2021 NDAA, and with the appropriate authorities for funding and the rest, that has to be executed in 23. But I do think that we often lament about the talent we don't have without looking internally, and I think that's a travesty.
So I'd build on that in a couple of ways. First, I definitely wanted to echo the narrative of Silicon Valley won't work with the Pentagon is incredibly overblown. But it's also something, that particular episode of Maven, that we walked right into. So for your pioneering use of AI by the military, of all the different topics that we might have chosen to go for sifting through drone strike video, that was about as controversial as it gets. And to give a actual illustration of that, I talked to the New York Times journalist who broke the story, and I asked him, what if it had been a project to use AI to help the Navy personnel system match people to the best appropriate role? Would this have been a front page story? And he's like, God, no, it wouldn't have even been a story. And actually, if we're thinking about it, which would make a greater difference between the US military winning a future war or not? I'd argue it's applying AI to our personnel system. But even beyond it, when we think about, that revolt of the Google, employees against Maven, recall they also revolted against their senior leadership when the senior leadership wanted them to help with Chinese censorship. So, again, celebrate the fact that they live in a country where they could say, you know what, I don't want to work on this. That's their right. But in particular, that narrative, beware of companies that describe themselves as great patriot companies and describe their adversaries in the marketplace as unpatriotic. Something else is going on there. So they're not selling by having the best product. They're selling themselves by painting themselves as more of a patriot than another. So beware of that. A larger issue that, to echo that personnel aspect, is that I think it's really about our own systems and how we draw in that, whether it's how much of it is Silicon Valley doesn't want to work with us versus the Pentagon personnel system itself. How do we bring in outside talent? It's archaic, it's broken. Is it really the top startups in the world don't want to work with the military? They look at the Pentagon acquisition and contracting system and go, I don't even know where to start. And I'll give my own personal experience of this. August Cole and I started up a little side project. It's actually a business, and we're trying to navigate the CIBR program right now. And I have a PhD and I can't figure it out. So, the point is, we need to, if we want to reach out to the best of American business and talent, we have to streamline it and make it easier for them rather than making it difficult for them. We should be surprised that if we're building these barriers that we're not getting the best.
I think anybody that's dealt with the SAM system certainly can feel your pain on things that we could do better ourselves. So I'm reminded that it is 4:30 in the morning in Sydney. So we're going to transition here. We're going to put this discussion on hold. We can absolutely circle back later in the conversation.